Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is India and United Nations organizations. Dear learners, this lecture will be of immense use for the students, learners from the discipline fields of political science, international relations, international media, also students preparing for several competitive examinations. In this lecture, we shall try to analyze the structure and functions of United Nations and therein situate the important role played by India, and also in our analysis discuss the aspect of need for reform of United Nations Security Council. Dear learners, in this lecture, we shall analyze the role played by international organizations. We shall look at the working of United Nations organizations, the scope for improvement in United Nations Security Council, looking at ambit of peacekeeping, and above all as to how in the various functions of United Nations, from maintaining peace, security to ensuring holistic development for the world, India has played a very important role. At the outset, let's understand that United Nations is a post-Second World War international organization that was founded in 1945. In order to understand the United Nations mission, in order to elaborate further on the work, one has to look at the purposes and the principles. And the principles of United Nations have been profoundly elaborated in its founding charter. The principles stated in the charter, the aims mentioned in the United Nations Charter have been implemented by various organs and specialized agencies. Let's have an understanding of the historical perspective also as we deliberate the working of United Nations. In 1899, the International Peace Conference was held in The Hague to elaborate instruments for settling down crises, looking into issues of peace, preventing wars, working out codes for rules for warfare, amongst others. This conference adopted the Convention for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes, and this established the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which began work in 1902. As we look at the working of UN, it's very important to understand that history tells us that the forerunner for United Nations was the League of Nations, an international organization that was there at the end of the First World War, established in 1919 under the Treaty of Versailles. And if we go by the clauses in Treaty of Versailles, it says that the League of Nations was there to promote international cooperation and achieve peace and security. At the same time, it's very important to understand that how the International Labour Organization, which was created in 1919 under the Treaty of Versailles as an affiliated agency of the League. The term United Nations was coined by United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt. A document called the Declaration by United Nations was signed in 1942 by 26 countries. The countries came together wherein their governments pledged and decided to continue fighting together against the Axis powers. And again, the accounts of Second World War history tell us this was Rome, Berlin, Tokyo axis. And at the same time, the governments of various countries decided to bound them against making a separate peace. The United Nations Conference on International Organization, 1945 conference that was held in San Francisco, United States of America, signed the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter of 1945 is the foundational treaty for United Nations as an intergovernmental organization. This brings us to the next aspect, that the main organs of United Nations, and they are the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice, and the UN Secretariat. The Trusteeship Council also exists, but it later is ceased to exist. Dear learners, so now the Charter clearly tells us, and we will look into account the 4 broad purposes, and we read as codified by the Charter: maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations amongst nations, cooperate in solving international problems and in promoting respect for human rights, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. Dear learners, this brings us to the next important aspect, that when we look into account the role that has been played by India with respect to United Nations. India was amongst the original members of United Nations that signed the declaration by United Nations at Washington in October of 1944. India also participated at the United Nations Conference on International Organization at San Francisco from 25th April to 26 June 1945. India, as a founding member of United Nations, has always ensured to support the purposes and the principles of the United Nations. It has made significant, invaluable contributions in implementing the goals of the Charter, as well as when we look at how with time there has been evolution of United Nations specialized programs and agencies, wherein which also India has made significant contributions. Some examples, when we see that how in case of Korea, India voted for Resolution 82/1950 but abstained on Resolution 84/1950. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, India abstained on Resolution 1770. This is in 1992. In case of Somalia, India voted for Resolution 794/1992 on US-led force. In case of Libya, India abstained on Resolution 1973-2011. In case of Mali, India supported Resolution 2085-2012 for African-led force. So this tells us that how India has supported humanitarian intervention, but also opposed beyond security mechanisms that were envisaged in some Security Council resolutions. Further, India has voiced out strong reservations in military interventions wherein which there was resort to use of force, intrusive in nature, amongst others. An important document here for revision is the speech by Ambassador Sinha tendered at the Tezpur University. Learners must get this speech for looking into account the aspects of differentiated approach by India with respect to humanitarian intervention and security mechanisms. India has always supported the United Nations agenda, from working out the issue of reform, the global economic order. India, when we look into India's role, one has to point out that how India was instrumental in setting up of the United Nations Conference on Trade Action and Development in 1964, UNCTAD, for promoting trade and development. When we look at various events and news circulating with respect to United Nations and specialized agencies stand on various aspects of global governance involving reforming global economic order, debt relief, preferential market access, South-South cooperation, protecting commodity exports, need for having greater voice for developing countries in international monetary and trade institutions. India has always voiced concerns on these issues. India has always supported the cause for a reformed global economic order. Then another aspect of United Nations work is that of peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is the biggest activity of United Nations today. It is a reflection of ramifications in the realm of maintaining peace at the global level. When we look at the role of India, it is commendable how India has played a very important role, a key role in the evolution of peacekeeping activities and missions, especially with respect to the Congo mission right from 1960 to 1964. Therefore, India has consistently been a major contributor to UN peacekeeping. Further, one of the aspects of United Nations principles is that of against discrimination, saying no to discrimination of any kind. India stood firm against apartheid. It opposed apartheid, which led to the imposition of sanctions against South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, which is presently now the Zimbabwe. United Nations has given great emphasis on protection of human rights, promoting democracy, combating terrorism, amongst others. India has been at the forefront of all such initiatives. When we look at that, how the agenda of United Nations with respect to security is also witnessing a change. Dear learners, what we are seeing that today, security is multidimensional. It ranges from military to non-military, traditional army military security perspective to the non-traditional security perspective like climate change, pandemics, ecological devastation, aspects of economy, amongst others. When we look at climate change, India has been recognized as a drafting author of the agreements and a leader within the Brazil, South Africa, India, the basic coalition, as well as a leader in the broader G77 coalition at both Copenhagen and Paris conferences of the parties. So this shows us that how India has affirmed support to United Nations agenda besides the traditional agenda of security. Further, when we look at the traditional security perspective also, India has been a member of the United Nations Security Council for 8 terms. If we go by the data from various United Nations news, with the most recent one being the 2021 to 2022. India as a member of G4. Dear learners, G4 is a group of nations that support, that back each other in seeking a permanent seat at the Security Council. The G4 also advocates a reformation of the United Nations Security Council. Further, India is also part of G77. So what we find here is that India as a charter member of United Nations and participating in all specialized agencies, putting a firm voice in various work of United Nations. India has contributed troops to United Nations peacekeeping efforts. Korea, Egypt, Congo in its earlier years, as we saw in Somalia, Angola, Liberia, Lebanon, Rwanda, amongst others. Further, when we are looking at the role of India with reference to United Nations, one also has to take into account the changes in the context. Dear learners, the present world is very different. Today, there are many new problems and realities. The challenges further are cutting across nations. They are transnational in nature. So when we hear about pandemics, climate crisis, cybersecurity, they are known traditional security threats, and therein which there is a debate also that whether United Nations, looking at the multilateral world order, there is effectiveness, efficacy in dealing with global issues. Are the challenges and solutions and collaborative efforts rightly balanced? These are questions that are often reflected when we are debating a world wherein world is seeing rise of new Cold War, or perhaps changes in dynamics of warfare with trade war, conflict between United States and China, and such conflict not just affects the respective superpowers but also has an impact on the world economy, on management of tariffs world over. So thereby, dear learners, one has to take into account there are therefore questions, issues on the effectiveness of United Nations with respect to the veto powers possessed by United Nations 5 permanent members. The question that is largely there, that does the representative aspect of international organization, a significant post-Second World War organization like United Nations that has played a very important role in world peace and security, does it reflect today's global realities? Further, then one looks at that how there is an overlapping also, that how the work of ECOSOC, as critics argue, is overshadowed by the institutions such as IMF and the World Bank. There are remarks on lack of democratic processes, transparency, accountability, and looking at the bigger picture of financial crisis. And what we see that the issues of financial aspect, issues of institutional aspects were there with the League of Nations, as well as these issues are being noted presently with the United Nations also. Dear learners, we all know that United Nations General Assembly can only make non-binding recommendations, and today there are question marks over this. Further, all members of United Nations agreed to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council, while other organs of United Nations make recommendations to member states. Only the Security Council has the power to make decisions that member states are then obligated to implement under the Charter. The United Nations Security Council is composed of 15 members, 5 permanent members, China, France, Russia, United States and United Kingdom, and 10 non-permanent members who are elected by the General Assembly. The non-permanent members are elected for 2 years term, so that every year the General Assembly elects 5 non-permanent members out of total of 10. These 10 seats are distributed amongst the regions of the world. 5 seats for African and Asian countries, 1 for Eastern European country, 2 for Latin American and Caribbean countries, and 2 for Western Europe and other countries. The group of 4 that we just discussed, countries like Brazil, Germany, India, Japan, they advocate a permanent seat for all of them, and above all, a very important aspect of the need for reforms of the structure and representative aspect of United Nations organs. India had assumed the role of non-permanent member at the United Nations in 2011-2012. That's about the last time. And prior to this, it was non-permanent member in 1950-51, 67-68, 1972-73, 1977-78, 1984-85 and 1991-92. Now, India being the second most populated country in the world, It is one of the world's largest democracy, one of the largest economies, one of the largest contributors of United Nations peacekeeping forces. Thereby, there are remarks, and when India is absent from a very important aspect of the UN system, the United Nations Security Council, thereby there are question marks on the credibility, representative aspect with respect to global world realities and present challenges of the United Nations system. A very important aspect to enlighten us more on this issue, for that we take reference to the remarks and the address of the Indian Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji, addresses at the General Debate of the General Assembly 75th session. Dear learners, this is dated 26 September 2020 and we take reference to un.org news or archive. The Prime Minister of India Shri Narendra Modi ji declared that United Nations indeed, as we look at the aspect of United Nations reform, this is the need of the hour. Further, when we are looking at that how as a post-Second World War international organization, how do we situate United Nations in the present day scenario? The remarks of PM Modi, that is that international community now must reflect, must ask, must deliberate if the United Nations is still relevant after 75 years of its foundation. No doubt there has been great achievements of United Nations, but yet one cannot ignore the aspect that today's challenges are vastly different from those of the past. Further, when we look at the aspect of COVID-19 pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, today the question that has been raised by PM Modi at the General Assembly debate, that is the 75th session, that is, where is the United Nations in this joint fight against the pandemic? Where is its effective response? Further, a very important remark, that is how long, when we look at from the perspective of India, how long would a country have to wait, particularly when the transformational changes happening in that country affect a large part of the world. Further, India treats the entire world as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that is whole world as one family. So therefore, dear learners, when we look at how India's presence in so many, approximately more than 50 United Nations peacekeeping missions, further international initiatives launched by India, which have propagated the work of and the pillars, the mission of United Nations also, that is International Day of Non-Violence, International Day of Yoga. So in all these realms, no doubt India has played a very important role with respect to United Nations. So dear learners, as we conclude from the lecture, we find that no doubt India has played a very important role in the supporting the work, the mission, the purposes of United Nations. India has always been in support of UN principles and functions, from opposition of apartheid, from opposition of discrimination, against colonization, and above all working to ensure and maintain international peace and security, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, promoting sustainable development, amongst others. Therefore, looking at the changes in the world reality, today there is a need, that is need of reforms at United Nations. And looking at that aspect, one cannot ignore the need to reform the institutional, the representative aspect of United Nations, looking at how global realities have changed today, looking at the fact that how India has been a very important supporter of UN, the second most populated country in the world, the largest democracy in the world, one of the largest economies, and one of the largest contributors in several missions, aims and purposes of United Nations. So therefore, this absence, this vacuum, this lacuna has to be worked out by due reforms in the United Nations system. The need of the hour here is that one reflects on the great achievements of UN as well as analyze that how today's challenges, the issues of crisis are very different from the time when United Nations was formed. So therefore, dear learners, India has played a very important role in the working, in propagation of the mission, the goals of United Nations, and United Nations further needs to be reformed, wherein which the concerns, the aspects of work at different levels of development, ensuring peace and security by India shall indeed be important for ensuring a holistic and comprehensive development in the future of global world. Thank you very much, dear learners, for being with us for the lecture on India and United Nations Organization. Thank you.